Hey, feeling good, like I should. When in dark, walk around the neighborhood, feeling blessed.
Hey guys, welcome back to yet another video on Natalie's Reviewing History channel. Today we'll be going over chapter 1.2, what was the impact of imperial expansionism on international relations? To begin with, in the late 19th century, as we learned in the video before, the European countries are competing fiercely for land, raw materials, and power between each other. Nationalism was strong, and governments kept pushing harder and harder to get these overseas territories, and citizens were more open to imperialism and kept supporting it, even if it meant their country being aggressive. So, the impact of growth of overseas empires on relations between European nations. A good example of imperialism where it caused tensions between the European nations is the Fashoda incident from 1898, where Britain and France almost went to war over Sudan. They both wanted control, but after a tense standoff, they compromised. France backed off in Africa, and Britain recognized France's role in Morocco. Another example is Germany's push for a place in the sun, which made things even worse. Kaiser Wilhelm II wanted Germany to become a world power by gaining colonies. Germany's late start in the race for land, especially in Africa, worried Britain because Britain feared that Germany's growing power, especially in its navy, threatened British security. Since Britain is like a peninsula or like an island really, and Germany had a direct route to attack them through the sea, since their navy kept growing, and Britain wasn't really focused on their land, but they were focused on their colonies, so they weren't as armed around their area. So the British, it threatened their security and their trade routes, and this competition made countries build up their armies and navies, creating more and more tensions between the countries. The relationship between Britain and France improved by 1904 because they signed the Entente Cordiale, and they settled their differences in Africa, mainly over Morocco. Disputes with China over imperial expansionism, the Boxer Rebellion. So while European countries avoided fighting with each other, their battles over land in places like China got a little out of control because China had been closed off to outsiders, but they started opening their borders and letting trade for businesses and economies to be better. And Britain became China's top trading partner after forcing China to accept opium imports. And after they lost 2 wars to Britain, China had to open their ports to even more foreigners. So by the late 1800s, cities like Shanghai and Canton were filled with foreign diplomats and traders. There was countries like Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, and the USA, and all of these divided China into areas they controlled, which these can also be called spheres of influence within the country because these nations had larger authority over the land than China itself. China's weaknesses became clear during this era because Chinese nationalists tried to push foreigners out, but they were crushed by an alliance from the foreign powers, like the open door policy and other things like that. China had to pay millions in damages and became even more controlled by the foreign powers. It just kept getting worse for China. And although Europe worked together to crush the rebellion, their competition in China was still growing. The tensions between Britain and Germany over South Africa, there was a lot of disputes over control in South Africa, and this really showed how brutal imperialism could be. Britain had taken control of the Cape Colony from the Dutch. The Dutch settlers that lived there were called the Boers, and when the slavery ended, the Boers moved inwards into the land, and they formed their own little areas, their republics. And they discovered diamonds, which brought many British settlers, and it caused a lot of tension in the area since the Britain tried to control the Boers, and they resisted. There was the first Boer War, which was in 1880 to 1881, and the Boers won the right to self-rule themselves. And in 1899, the tensions exploded again in the Second Boer War because now the Boers were being helped by Germany because they were sending them weapons. And at first, they were defeating the British troops, which was like unlikely. And then Britain responded by sending like a lot more troops, and they used a brutal method called scorched earth, where they would set up concentration camps and kill them in mass amounts, targeting like the women and the kids. And by 1902, Britain won and had controlled South Africa, but like Britain's reputation was ruined because this was really aggressive of them. Attempts to resolve tensions between imperial nations. Despite all the competition, European nations did try to avoid direct wars with each other. One example of this that I mentioned in the last video was the Berlin Conference, which was when the European leaders met to set rules for taking land in Africa. Like they would agree to the claims and like they made their own borders, which ended up being bad for Africa, but at least like they tried to settle peace between themselves. But this helped slow direct conflicts, and it helped Britain and France during the Fashoda incident to compromise instead of actually going to war. But this doesn't mean that the rivalries just disappeared. The European nations carved out like their own areas in the Chinese government too, and this showed how China was weak. And while China was weak, Japan rose as a power and led to the first Sino-Japanese War, but thankfully it was ended with the Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895. But this also worried European countries since Japan was a growing power and took over Port Arthur. And yeah, like France and Germany wanted to protect their own interests, so like everybody was really looking out for like themselves at that time. And while there were many other efforts made to avoid war, the intense efforts from each nation to take over a piece of Africa made it hard to avoid in the end. That's all for this video, and I hope it was helpful. Goodbye.